The goal of Apollo is to make epidemic simulators more available and useful in public health practice. Apollo is funded by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, which also funds the Midas Research Network, which has been developing epidemic simulators and other types of disease transmission models for the past decade. The specific aims of the project relevant to this talk are to create an ontology of epidemic modeling called Apollo SV Structured Vocabulary and an XML schema for messages and to deploy it in the Apollo Web Services. The main use case behind the Apollo Web Services is an end user who wants a single point of access to epidemic simulators and other disease transmission models. When using Apollo Web Services with standardized messages, the end user specifies an analytic problem which we define as a configuration of the simulator with a scenario and a query of results of the simulation exactly once, and can then submit the scenario to multiple simulators, which is a form of sensitivity analysis that was highly desired by decision makers during the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic. Before getting into the details of the Apollo Web Services, Apollo SV ontology, and XML schema, we want to show a clip of an end-user app that uses Apollo version 1.3.1. This simple Apollo end-user app can access three simulators: a Reed Frost SCIR compartmental simulator running at the University of Pittsburgh, the Flute agent-based simulator also running at the University of Pittsburgh, and the FRED agent-based simulator running at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. A user can create a scenario from scratch or retrieve a saved scenario. Here, we retrieve a scenario representing the 2009 H1N1 influenza outbreak in Los Angeles County at a point that was 4 weeks before the new H1N1 vaccine was expected to become available. The scenario specifies the prevalence of susceptible, exposed, infectious, and resistant individuals, the H1N1 infection's infectious period, latent period, and basic reproduction number, and the effectiveness of the new vaccine. The scenario includes a vaccination-based control strategy, which has a representation of the expected future delivery of vaccine doses and the daily administration capacity. We now select three simulators and then click Run Epidemic Simulator. This status area reported the progress of the simulators and other services involved in simulation results. The agent-based simulators can take an hour or longer to execute, but this scenario has been run previously, so its results were in Apollo's cache. The results are displayed in tabs on the right. We see a comparative plot of the incidence per day predicted by the simulators, and we can view a video of the spatial dynamics of the FRED simulated outbreak over time. The next slides explain the web services involved in the demo we just saw. The rectangle on the left represents an end-user application. On the right is the FRED agent-based simulator, and beneath FRED, a relational database into which FRED writes its results. The two diamonds in the middle represent the Apollo service, which mainly functions to route jobs to simulators, and the PSC service, which is an instance of a simulator web service running at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, which hosts the FRED agent-based simulator. When the user clicked Run Simulation, the simple end-user Apollo app invoked the Run Simulation method of the Apollo service with a configuration object. The configuration object contains the scenario in Apollo terminology and syntax that we will discuss, and an Apollo ID for the FRED simulator and the run length of the simulation. The term configuration is from the Apollo SV ontology, which we will be setting in blue italics in this presentation. The Apollo service then called the run method of the PSC service, passing the configuration object as the parameter to the run method. The PSC service then called the Mr. T service, which translates from Apollo syntax into the native syntax of a simulator. On the right, we see part of Mr. T's translation of the Apollo scenario from the video into Fred native configuration syntax. Mr. T also returns verbose traces of its translation process, which the simple end-user app displays in tabs. Explanations in blue are informational. Explanations in red are warnings that the translated scenario is not identical to the Apollo scenario. At present, Apollo does not prevent untranslatable scenarios from running, although it could do so. Once the native configuration has been prepared, the run method of the PSC service starts the Fred simulator and returns a run ID to the end-user application. The end-user application polls the Apollo service every 6 seconds by invoking the getRunStatus method to determine whether the Fred simulation has completed. When a simulator has completed the job, it writes the results of the simulation in Apollo output format to the results database. We described the schema of the results database in our paper in the proceedings, so we will not describe it here. An end-user application queries the results database through visualizer services. It invokes the run visualization method with an SQL query. The visualizer service, the Gaia service in this example, generates GIFs and MPEGs from the results specified by the SQL query. The second half of this talk overviews the Apollo SV ontology and Apollo XML schema definition language, abbreviated XSD, which together define the message syntax of the Apollo Web Services. We are developing the message syntax to meet 2 requirements. It must be expressive enough to represent the inputs and outputs of the current simulators, and also those of yet-to-be-built really big models involving multiple pathogen and host species interacting in complex environments. Our process examines existing epidemic simulators from broader perspectives. Apollo SV treats epidemic simulators as a kind of disease transmission model, which in turn is a kind of population model. Apollo SV considers population models to be algorithms with inputs and outputs. Just a reminder that blue italics denote terms in Apollo SV. We use pink to denote terms that we are adding to Apollo SV. Our process also explores the ontological commitments made by models, which refers to the aspects of reality they choose to represent and those they choose to ignore. This perspective led us to see a simulator configuration as a partial representation of an ecosystem at some point in time, which corresponds to time 0 in model time. The ontological commitments are most clearly seen in the data and knowledge that modelers use when constructing and configuring disease transmission models. These data and knowledge are generated by observational and experimental studies, including censuses of populations, censuses of abiotic ecosystem elements such as reservoirs, disease surveillance systems, vaccination registries, seroprevalence surveys, EHRs, response management systems, environmental investigations, and routine environmental monitoring. The knowledge that modelers use include facts about infections, treatments, contaminations, diseases, and control measures. The product of this analysis is this design for the scenario part of a configuration message. We have partly implemented it in the current Apollo Web Services, and we plan to have it fully implemented in version 1.4. We will see more detail for the numbered sections in blue in the next slides. But before doing that, we should explain why we appear to be ignoring population and abiotic ecosystem censuses, which are obviously the bedrock of any scenario, in the same way that the cast of characters and the set are the foundation of a theatrical production. The reason is that in existing simulators, populations and abiotic ecosystem elements are usually not user configurable. Apollo SV defines a population infection and immunity census as a census of the susceptible, infected, infectious, and immune status of all individuals in some population. On the right is a readable version of an instance of the XSD PII census type. The XSD type itself is a recursively defined exception tree. Using this type, we can efficiently represent available infection and immunity census data. For example, we can use a US level estimate for every subregion of the US except for California. And we can use a California estimate for every region in California except Los Angeles. The PIA census type also supports sociodemographic stratifications within regions, which are also inherited until an exception is encountered. Apollo SV defines an infection as reproduction of a pathogen inside some tissue of a host. An infection has a latent period and an infectious period. The corresponding XSD type follows the Apollo SV definition closely, except it currently has information about symptoms, which we plan to move into a disease type in version 1.4. Apollo SV defines infection acquisition rather than infection transmission. An infection is acquired from an infectious individual or a part of the abiotic ecosystem when that part is contaminated. The likelihood of acquisition is expressed by parameters such as the basic reproductive rate and transmission coefficient. The corresponding XSD mirrors this definition. Apollo SV defines a contaminated thing as an entity that contains a pathogen, either internal to itself or on its surface, that is not undergoing an infection. A corresponding type will be in version 1.4 of the XSD. Contamination acquisition is a biological process in which an entity that does not contain a pathogen becomes a contaminated entity. Apollo SV currently defines two classes of treatment, vaccination and antiviral treatment. The XSD has corresponding types, but we show here only the XSD types for vaccination. Note that the XSD type for vaccination efficacy allows an analyst to represent different efficacies for different vaccination preventable outcomes, and also by age and time since most recent vaccination. Apollo XSD 1.3.1 defines types for 6 control measures. You can see that control measures have many properties in common, such as start time, response delay, and compliance. To make one last point about the potential benefits of standardization, this very brief video shows how an analyst might reuse information about control measures or infections or entire scenarios. Here, a user who is creating a scenario left-clicks on control measures, which creates a context-sensitive query to the Apollo library and retrieval of 4 control measures. The end user reviews them, then right-clicks on the first to to incorporate it into the scenario and then reruns the simulator.